Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something that I think we can all relate to a little bit. It's fear. I mean, trying to understand sometimes it's like, ugh, it just feels overwhelming in itself. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And, fear is just part of being human. Like it's hardwired into us from the very beginning. And the thing is, that's not always a bad thing because fear is actually really important for keeping us safe.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting about this lecture too. Is like, it's not always just us like overthinking things.
Ugh.
It's like we feel fear more in our like gut than our head sometimes, even when we know like logically you shouldn't.
It really is interesting how that works. It's like you have one thought and boom, it's like a ripple effect. That one thought can trigger all these emotions and then we start avoiding things or we have physical reactions, even things like panic attacks. That's all part of what we call the vicious cycle of negative thought.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, you're about to give a presentation and suddenly your palms are sweating, your heart's racing, and forget about thinking clearly right.
Yes, exactly. That's your body's fight or flight response kicking in. Basically, your brain senses danger, whether it's real or not, and it floods your system with adrenaline. And that's where all those physical changes come from, your heart rate, your breathing even.
It's wild how much is going on that we don't even realize, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, uh, have you ever noticed how when you're anxious, you like have to use the bathroom more often?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're definitely not alone there. That's because when your body goes into that fight or flight mode, it also changes things like your blood pressure and digestion. But in all seriousness, this is why dealing with fear and anxiety long term is so important, because it can have real consequences for our physical health, like increasing the risk of heart disease.
It's like fear, worry, and anxiety.
Hmm.
They all team up on us. They're like this unholy trinity creating all kinds of mental and physical health challenges. So we've got this like unholy trinity messing with us. But where is all this happening? Like what's going on in our brains when we feel fear?
Well, remember how we were saying it can feel like we're being hijacked by fear? It's like that for a reason. There are actually three main parts of your brain that are really important for understanding fear and anxiety.
Okay, I am ready to hear about this brain stuff.
Okay, so think of your brain like it's a house. Down in the basement, you have your brainstem. That's like the oldest part of your brain. It controls all the automatic stuff like breathing and your heartbeat. It's the OG survival expert.
The OG, keeping everything running. I love it.
Exactly. Now let's head upstairs to the living room. This is your limbic system where you process all your emotions and memories, and it's got a direct line to your body's alarm system.
Okay, so if that's the feeling center, what about the thinking part? Where does that happen?
That would be the top floor, the penthouse suite, your prefrontal cortex. It's the executive office in charge of planning, decisions, that kind of thing. It usually keeps your impulses in check.
This is so cool. Okay, so walk me through it. Let's say like a huge spider suddenly drops from the ceiling. What happens in my brain house?
Okay, spider situation. Down in the basement, your brainstem is flipping on the fight or flight switch. Your heart starts racing, your palms get sweaty, the works. At the same time, up in the living room, your limbic system is like, whoa, danger. It's making sure you feel that fear.
And what about the prefrontal cortex? That calm and cool decision maker.
Well, here's the thing. When you're super stressed, your brain has to prioritize. So it's like your prefrontal cortex gets put on hold. It's like a temporary eviction from the penthouse. Meanwhile, the rest of your brain is trying to deal with the threat.
So that's why it feels like you can't think straight when you're afraid. The thinking part of your brain is literally offline.
You got it. But it is important to remember that not all fear is bad. Healthy fear, like the kind that keeps you from petting a growling dog, is a good thing. But then there's the kind of fear that paralyzes you.
Right, it's all about balance. It's like what the lecture said about the fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
In a spiritual sense, fear isn't always bad. It can actually help us make good choices.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the brain and fear, but how does this actually like play out in our lives? The lecture talks about different ways fear shows up, like worry, anxiety, phobias, and this thing called overcare, which I have to admit I never really thought about before.
Yeah, overcare. It's interesting how that works. I mean, we hear about worry and anxiety all the time, right?
Right.
It's like they're these annoying house guests that just won't leave.
They just won't go away.
Worry is that like broken record of what if, what if, what if. And anxiety is that like general feeling of unease that you can't quite put your finger on.
And then there are phobias, which are like fear times 1,000, like spiders, heights, public speaking.
Yeah.
When your brain decides something is a threat, even if you know logically it's not that big of a deal.
Exactly. But overcare, that's a sneaky one. It's when you care so much about something that it starts to control you. Remember that example from the lecture about how sometimes people are afraid of flying because deep down they're afraid of dying?
Yeah.
That's overcare.
And it's like what the lecture was saying about how even good things like serving in a church can become sources of overcare. It's like that desire to help
Huh.
can turn into this fear of judgment or messing up or something.
It is. It's a good example of how fear can creep into even our best intentions. And this is where the spiritual side of things comes in. Because, the lecture talks about how fear can actually open the door for negative spiritual influences.
It's not about placing blame or anything. It's just about realizing that when we let fear control us,
Yeah.
it can make us vulnerable. So how do we deal with this? The lecture doesn't just leave us hanging, does it?
No, not at all. There are tons of ways to overcome fear and anxiety, like exposure therapy, where you gradually face your fears in a safe way. And then there's cognitive behavioral therapy, which is about changing your thought patterns. And of course, medication can help some people manage their symptoms, although it doesn't always address the root of the problem.
Right. And what I liked is how the lecture pointed out that sometimes those approaches that only focus on like the practical stuff miss the bigger picture. Like
Yeah.
we're not just minds and bodies. There's a spiritual side to us too.
Exactly. We need to think holistically. The lecture really emphasizes that true freedom from fear comes from a place of faith and trusting in God. It's about finding that deep sense of peace and security that comes from within.
It really is. Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. We talked about the science behind fear, how it affects us, and most importantly, how to start overcoming it. But before we go, here's something I want you to think about. When you feel that fear creeping in, what are some things you can do right then and there to calm yourself down? Remember, knowledge is power. And when we understand fear, we can start to take back control. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.